proposals you're working on. Also, feel free to use the chat if you have questions at any point. Depending on the question, we may save it till the very end or the very end of the element that we're going over, but Dana will be monitoring those questions, so we will get to them before the end of the session today, and there will be time at the very end for those questions. And I'm just going to put the chat, put the link to the slides in the chat again if you didn't already get them. And we'll get started. So how did this how did this presentation actually come about? I'm sorry, I'm not as caffeinated as I should be at this point in the morning. So to start with, I'm a really systems-oriented thinker. I like frameworks, I like my checklists, I like rubrics. They make me feel confident that I'm where I'm supposed to be in any kind of undertaking that I'm pursuing. So as you can imagine, when I was a new librarian, I felt really lost and frustrated when I started getting active in presenting. Writing proposals was absolute agony for me because I never felt like I knew if my proposal was good enough or thorough enough or succinct enough. And what I really needed was a model, but there really wasn't anyone out there. So what I decided that I would do was going to try to figure out on my own what made for an effective conference proposal. So as a result of picking apart a number of conference descriptions over the years, as I attended, I realized that the really compelling ones had some of the same elements in common. The last model came about from this, and that's what I'm going to show you today, but I do want to stress that what I am showing you is just a model that I've used and refined over a number of years. It's worked for me, it's worked for others that I've shared it with, but it's not the only way to write a proposal. And of course, you might need to tweak it to suit your needs, but I do want to share it because if you're like me and you like having structure to work with when writing, you might find this approach really helpful. It's also helped me to more easily let go of, let's say, like the bad feelings that come after you present a presentation and there's that attendee who wants to know why you didn't cover X, Y, and Z in your description, in your session. And usually what I say is, well, it's out of scope for the session as per the description. So knowing that I wrote a clear and concise description means that I never have to feel bad about somebody being disappointed at the end of a presentation, and the fact that I didn't give them something I never promised them in the first place. I also have another motive for sharing this presentation. As someone who frequently serves as a reviewer for conferences, I am always stunned when I see presentations that don't articulate the session's basic aims. They don't make it clear why and for whom the session is important, and they don't even cover what the attendees can hope to gain from the session. So in sharing this model, I hope to improve the experience of folks who are like me, who are reading conference proposals, but also the experience of attendees so that they can effectively choose where to allocate their time when they're at a conference. So what is the LASTT model? The LASTT method we'll go into in depth in just a few minutes, but it's really just a series of components that, again, in my opinion and my experience, comprise a really clear and compelling proposal. So landscape addresses the bigger picture into which your presentation's focus falls. Absence identifies a need that drives the importance of your session. Side effect is essentially the so what as it relates to what's missing. Treatment describes the manner in which you're going to convey your content, and the takeaways convey what's in it for the audience if they choose to attend your program, or the conference program committee if they choose to accept your proposal. So landscape. This is about situating your focus within the bigger picture that relates to your session. This is really important because those who are evaluating your proposals may not understand the importance or the value of your presentation because they aren't operating in your discipline. So for example, if you're submitting to a conference that may be outside the library world, I've done that before and I'll show you one example. Or the reviewers might not be familiar with your area of librarianship. So for example, if you have a technical service librarian evaluating an information literacy session proposal and vice versa. Now, I know ideally programs should be evaluated by folks who are working in the same area of expertise, But the reality is this is often not how it works, especially when you have smaller conferences. So you have to be prepared to contextualize your topic succinctly so that it makes sense to a variety of reviewers with a variety of backgrounds. When possible, and it's not always possible, and it depends on your focus too, it should also be informed by the literature and the work that's already been done in your area that you're planning to present on. And it doesn't just mean the peer-reviewed literature, but it can also include what's been covered in past presentations at that particular conference that you're presenting to or hoping to present at. I've included examples for every one of these elements that would show you how I've incorporated them. So again, you can come back to these, but just to go over them real quickly, this is one example of a successful poster session that I co-presented at Open Ed in 2018. So if the main content of my poster concerns how to gauge how ready instructors are to adopt OER, I need to set the stage for why OER adoption in community college is important in the first place. And I do so by painting the big picture. That is, by demonstrating how much students are spending on text and the disparity that exists between textbook spending for community college students and students at four-year colleges. This proposal was accepted by the Textbook and Academic Authoring Conference. Now, in disclaimer, we couldn't present at the conference because of COVID, which interrupted a lot of things, but we ultimately ended up doing a virtual version of this program. So the goal of this presentation was to introduce Creative Commons licensing to those who may not already be familiar with it. And so for my audience to understand why it would be important that they attend such a session, I needed to situate the offering within the larger context. So in this case, I've illustrated a landscape in which Creative Commons licensing is no longer a novel. It's ubiquitous even in academic publishing. And so it's important for anyone engaged in publishing, which is the whole focus of the organization, to have an understanding of what these licenses mean. So as I said, I want to give you a minute to kind of process this all. Again, you're not going to be able to do the writing all in this 1 hour session, but these are the slides you can come back to guide your thinking and how you're going to accomplish this in your own proposal. So again, how are you going to put that topic in perspective for an audience that doesn't necessarily have your background or knowledge in the topic? What does your audience need to know about what's currently going on in your discipline, your professional literature, and so on, to appreciate why your topic is worthy of a slot at the conference? And can you concretize this with citations, with statistics, and so on? So again, landscape is about setting the stage and placing your topic within the larger picture of what's going on so that those who are reading your proposal understand why it's so important. The next element is absence. So in academic writing in particular, we like to emphasize the importance of finding a gap. And it's the same case I've found with conference proposals, because at the end of the day, if we already knew everything we needed to know about either the theoretical or the practical applications of the topic, we wouldn't need a conference session on it, right? So again, absence asks what's missing, where's the gap or the shortcoming. And again, I have two examples in past presentations of how I've done this in my own proposals. So in our Open Ed proposal, what's missing from the conversation about OER adoption at community colleges? Well, we've talked about a number of issues related to implementation, but we haven't talked about the role of instructor readiness in OER adoption. So that is where my gap is. In the TAA example, I've already illustrated a landscape in which Creative Commons licensing is ubiquitous, but I've also highlighted a pretty important absence, which is the ability to decipher the licenses. So again, some things to guide your thinking as you consider how you're going to articulate or identify that absence. So what is missing in literature or in the current conference offerings or current professional development offerings? And again, I can't stress enough how important it is when you're going to write a proposal to take a look at the last couple of years of the conference offerings, because that can be very, very helpful in identifying what hasn't been covered or what has been covered and the new angle you might need to take. So articulating the absence, I find, can be a little difficult. So what I've done for you is I have created some sentence starters, I like to call them. And these are some helpful structures for helping to begin to articulate what the absence is. So for instance, we could say things like the literature is not currently exploring blank. The literature has explored this topic, but not from this particular viewpoint or with regard to a particular population, or maybe the literature has, or the conference proposals in the past have explored this topic, but the methods have been flawed, maybe they've been insufficient, or maybe they've just been inconclusive, and your presentation is extending this in that particular area. So again, sentence starters can be really helpful when you're starting to articulate the absence. So side effect is the next element. So if absence asks what's missing, then the side effect is the follow-up question, so what? If there's an absence in the field or within a body of literature, but that absence has no theoretical or practical impact or importance, we don't need a session on it. So I like to think of this particular image when I'm thinking about side effects. So we've got the person sitting on the bench, and just knowing that there are more trees behind that gap in the picture doesn't really have a whole lot of importance, but knowing that there's a bear behind that gap might be important because there's danger that we want to avoid. Knowing that maybe there's an endangered species building their nest behind that gap is important because we want to do everything we can to protect it. So again, it's about like, does it matter what's behind the gap? Somebody may not have done a study before, they may not have looked at something in a certain way, but if there is no practical importance to doing that, it may not warrant a conference session. So again, I have some examples of how I've incorporated this into actual proposals. Again, 2 different formats. This is the poster presentation proposal. So for example, in this one, what's going to happen if we don't pay attention to instructor readiness to adopt and implement OER? We are going to waste time, we're going to waste money, and we're going to waste energy. In the TAA proposal, what's going to happen if Creative Commons licenses still remain a mystery to writers? Well, authors are going to miss out on the benefits of using and creating openly licensed resources, and users are going to miss out on opportunities that would have otherwise been afforded to them by an open license. So again, a couple of things to think about when you're articulating, what's going to be problematic about not addressing this gap. So what are going to be the practical, the applied, or theoretical consequences of failing to address the absence? And again, I've created for you a bunch of sentence starters that you can use to start generating some thoughts about the side effect as it relates to your particular proposal. So again, maybe we're not exploring a particular topic because if we don't, there will be particular consequences. Maybe we're not exploring it from a particular viewpoint or with a particular population, and that is going to have specific consequences. And on the flip side, if we do, that's going to have particular benefits. And again, it doesn't have to be something, I know I'm phrasing it a lot like the peer-reviewed literature, but it could be as simple as we just don't have enough examples of this in practice. And so by looking at X in a particular conference format, we are going to have more models that folks can draw on in their practice. So it doesn't have to be super formulaic like a peer-reviewed journal article. It could just be articulating that we don't have enough examples. We need more models so that folks from different libraries or libraries similar to the one like yours that you're doing the presentation or context in can draw from and have something to work with in this particular area. The next element is treatment. So this is an area that provides information on your particular approach to the presentation, which can include any theoretical approach. So for example, maybe you want to use resistance theory to demonstrate how librarians can create counter-narratives in a given situation. It can also include any practical approach, such as, let's say, presenting, again, a case study of an outreach activity that can serve for models in similar libraries that you're taking to address the issues that you've highlighted in both the absence and the side effect elements. So this is a place where you can also, and I highly recommend, addressing the format of the presentation, as well as what's going to be required of the attendees in terms of tools, interaction, previous knowledge, and so on. And again, I have some examples for you of how I actually incorporate this into actual proposals. So here's how we're going to treat the topic by operationalizing an existing theoretical construct. And here's how we're going to convey that information as a poster. And I know it may seem very silly to emphasize the format as treatment, because we often check off a box that says we're going to propose a particular type of session. But I recommend doing this because as someone who reviews proposals, I sometimes get the proposal decoupled from any other contextual information about the intended format of the presentation. So if I were looking at this, I might reject it or send it back for revisions if I mistakenly thought it was for a 30-minute presentation, because I would be looking for a better understanding of what attendees would be gaining from the session, which we'll talk about in just a minute. For the TAA example, I included this because in this case, the treatment is also the takeaway, because all we're doing in this presentation is conveying factual and conceptual knowledge about a topic. So this particular element is very flexible, and you may find that you are combining elements. So don't feel like it's only going to be a good proposal if it has every single element separately laid out. That's not necessarily the case. So I wanted to include this one because in this case, we managed to combine the takeaway and the treatment. So some things to think about addressing the treatment in your particular proposal. So how are you going to approach the treatment of your topic? In order to convey the treatment of your topic effectively, what expectations do you have of your attendees in terms of materials, interaction, previous knowledge, and so on? And I always like to include this because I don't like going to a session personally as an attendee where I didn't know there was going to be a high level of interaction. I need to prepare myself mentally for that. And if you get thrown into that, you know, I find it to be rough. So I like to give anybody who might be attending my session an understanding of what they're going to be asked to do and also what they need to bring. There's nothing worse than showing up to a session where you need like a laptop or a tablet and all you have is a notepad. So it's a courtesy, these little things, to your attendees. You can also consider the theoretical lens, the practical framework, or the line of questioning that you're going to use to address the absence. And again, I've included some sentence starters. You might also want to consider how you're going to engage the audience in the presentation. I know a lot of proposals now are asking for components that address interaction. So it's something you might want to think about as well, because some proposals may require it. And again, I can't stress enough, include the format as part of your proposal as well, because again, for reviewers, that information is often decoupled, and it's really helpful for us when we're thinking about, can you do what you're saying you want to do in this particular format, by knowing what that format is, because it's embedded right in the proposal. And finally, we have takeaways. So writing learning objectives is an entire workshop in and of itself. And it's one that I actually do every year for our faculty center. So while developing objectives in and of itself is going to be beyond the scope of this session, as per the description, my favorite phrase, as I mentioned before, I will include a brief overview of my process, and I will provide you with a portion of that workshop that I teach so that you can take a deeper dive at your own pace. So takeaways don't have to be complicated. As you're going to see from some of the examples that I'll provide to you, essentially your proposal just needs to be clear about what attendees are actually going to get out of the session. And this is not the same as what you are going to cover in the session. An outline of the session is not your takeaway for the session. This is about identifying the kind of knowledge that your attendees are going to gain and what they're going to be able to do with that knowledge. And I almost always utilize Bloom's revised taxonomy to do this, but it is important to note this is not the only way to craft objectives. I just find that the specificity of the knowledge and the cognitive dimensions are really helpful, not only articulating what I hope my attendees are going to get out of the session, but as I go through this process, it helps me identify where and when I'm making an assumption about the prior knowledge my attendees need to bring into the session. which again helps me plan for when I have folks who maybe aren't bringing that knowledge to the session. So I have a plan, but it also helps if I get folks who are a little bit more advanced than what I am, shooting for in the session. There are two components to an objective statement. First, you have a verb, which represents a cognitive process, and this can range from simple to complex. Following the verb is a noun, which specifies the type of knowledge that's related to or going to be engaged by the cognitive process that's specified in the verb portion of the statement. So the knowledge dimension ranges from concrete to abstract. And again, going into this in depth is beyond the focus of this session, but I am including this so that when you go back over these slides, you can use it almost as a workbook as you develop your takeaways. So I just have one example here talking about how the cognitive and the how cognitive process and the knowledge domain work together. So one example would be attendees will learn to differentiate, which is the cognitive process, among green, hybrid, and gold OA, which is the conceptual knowledge, in the context of pathways to open access publication. So spending some time thinking about where the knowledge you hope to convey to your audience fits into this continuum, the knowledge dimension, I find really helps to understand what knowledge you may not realize you're expecting your audience to bring to the workshop. And in doing so, again, it helps you prepare for cases where your participants maybe haven't brought that knowledge into the workshop or maybe have some advanced knowledge. Because there's a lot of, re-envisioning your workshop on the fly. So this is helpful also for when you actually get to the presentation part of it. It also helps you figure out that if what you're proposing is going to be reasonable in the time allotted. So conveying factual and conceptual knowledge in a 45-minute presentation, I think, is pretty reasonable. But going from factual to metacognitive knowledge in the same time frame may not be as feasible. So again, I created a little table that you can use like a workbook. So once you familiarize yourself with the subtypes in each category, you can use this to start creating your knowledge and cognitive dimension pairs. If you've ever been to any kind of pedagogical workshop that touches on learning objectives, you've probably received one of these one-page handouts with a cognitive dimension and a bunch of terms you can use for each dimension. The problem I find with this is that it's usually just an outline and doesn't really do justice to the manner in which each level and sub-level are distinguished from one another. So on the following slides, I have a definition for you of what the overall domain entails, as well as what the subcategories in each domain entail. So again, we're not going to go over all of these in depth, but just to give you an understanding of why I'm doing this, we'll look at understand, which is a monster category. Because of this, terms like summarizing and explaining often get used interchangeably, but they actually connote very different cognitive processes. So whereas summarizing requires synthesizing information into an interview, explaining requires an identifying a cause and effect relationship. So the following charts, again, they aim to make clear these distinctions so that you can make your takeaways a little bit clearer. I also, because usually as part of the workshop, I include assessments associated with each domain. I've kept those in as well because it may be helpful for you, maybe not so much for a poster session or a presentation, but if you are proposing a workshop, these may be very helpful if you have some more time to incorporate assessments into the program that you're proposing. So we are going to fast forward through these, but they are there. They do have the definitions, some examples, and recommended assessment formats. Again, if you decide to do a workshop for a session, those assessments may be very helpful. So some examples of the takeaways. So as I said before, takeaways don't have to be these big, impressive lists of learning objectives. In this case, because it's a poster session, the takeaway is just an update on our project. That is what we have for attendees. That's what they're going to gain from the session. However, in our TAA workshop, we're much more specific. And we do combine the cognitive processes with the specific forms of knowledge. And you'll see we've got understand how copyright and Creative Commons licenses work in concert, identify and interpret each of the licenses, determine how the materials may or may not be used without permission, and select the license. So these all fit into those taxonomy categories. So thinking about the takeaway for your presentation, I think the problem with focusing on crafting learning objectives at the beginning of the process is that we try to format them before we've actually given thought to what we want our attendees to gain from the session. So for this activity, when you come back to these slides, what I'd like you to think about is the following questions, because you can always go back and adjust the actual wording later using the tables that we have on the previous slide. So think about things like, what should attendees know that they didn't know before your presentation? What should they be able to do that they couldn't do before your presentation? What do you want them to know, and what do you want them to be able to do with that knowledge? And sometimes it's helpful to think about how participants will enact what you've taught them when they go home to their own institution, whether it's in their own area of scholarship, their area of responsibility, their division, department. Think about how they're going to use that information or how they might use it. So finally, one of the things that I have encountered is that conferences will often ask for an abridged and expanded version of your proposal. And it's great when they let you know up front that they're going to ask for this. Sometimes it's part of the proposal process to give like a 100-word description and then a 250-word description. Sometimes it's a 250-word description and a 500-word description. But sometimes they ask for it after they've accepted it and they don't give you a huge amount of turnaround time. So what I recommend is part of your process, just practice scaling. So how you can do this is flexible. But what I recommend is starting with your 100-word proposal. And when I'm working through each element of the LASTT model, what I try to do to start with is to encapsulate each element in a single sentence. And then when I need to draft an expanded version, I treat each of the sentences in that 100-word or that abridged version as the topic sentence for the expanded version. And I expand each element by adding in supporting evidence and details as it relates to the element in which it's embedded. Sometimes people like to start with the longer description. That's absolutely fine. But keep in mind that when you scale down, what you want to think about is each of those beginning sentences in the longer proposal as being sort of like your topic sentences that should stand alone as a single paragraph. This process, I think, addresses a question that I've gotten in other versions of this workshop, and that is, do you advise thinking ahead to the program abstract while composing the proposal? And yes, absolutely. I think that practicing scaling your topic both up and down helps you work towards this, because often the proposal becomes the abstract. So that is pretty much using the model in a nutshell. I want you to know that we don't have time for questions, but I am available for questions anytime. All you need to do is email me. Please let me know if you're not sure how to incorporate one of these elements. If you have questions about how you're incorporating it, I am happy to take a look. And I will come back to the contact slide. But I just want you to know that I've plugged in additional examples so that if you want to practice pulling out each of those elements in the proposals that I've already written and had accepted to sessions, I have a nice variety here. And I think it even included, let's see, scaled down versions as well. So you can see versions where I've had to submit an abridged version and then the longer version. So with that, I want to open it up to questions. Any at all. You can use the chat. I'm going to pop in the slides again, just in case you did not grab them. I am going to pop in also my email address if you want to just copy and paste it. Any thoughts, any comments, any questions?
Actually, Danielle, I have a question. This is Susan Perry.
Hi, Susan.
This is might be outside the scope of your presentation, but just in general for conference presentations, if we ever find that we thought we had a really strong proposal, but it's not accepted, is there ever a case where the committee would give you more information so that you could use that feedback in the future? Do you know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. So I didn't touch on this, but okay. So even if you use this method and you write an amazing proposal, there are a number of reasons that it might not get accepted. It could be just the feeling or the fit of it. You're also competing against other folks who may be writing about the same topic, and they may have an angle on it that for some reason may be more applicable to the intended audience. So it's not foolproof. If you are rejected, you always have the right to reach out to the committee and ask, what was my rating and what were the comments? Now, every programming committee works a little bit differently, so they may not go through and give specific feedback. They may just do like a scale rating for it. So you can always ask for it, but you may not get exactly what you're looking for, but you should always ask because it's really helpful, especially if you want to propose that same presentation again. It could just be a matter of maybe you needed to tighten up its connection with the theme of the conference. For some conferences, they're super, tied into the theme, and other conferences, the theme is just kind of like a guideline, and you never really know. Unless you've proposed and been accepted and worked with that particular conference over the years. But you always have the right to ask for some feedback. Whether you get it, that may not happen, but
Right.
yeah, don't be afraid to ask for it.
Okay, great. Yeah, that helps. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, I see a question came in. Not sure how much experience you have with other types of conferences, but I'm wondering, how are proposals for library conferences different for those for English and humanities conferences? I know the structure of the actual presentation types are wildly different, but I'm not sure how much this proposal carries over, how much this difference carries over into the proposal. So I have not worked primarily with English and humanities conferences. I have presented at education conferences, at writing conferences, publishing conferences. I'm not as familiar with that. However, I think that what you might want to do is sit down with maybe the model and take a look at the past descriptions from the particular conference that you are looking to submit your proposal to in the disciplinary area that you're looking at. You might want to check out for English and humanities to see if the MLA guide has any, perhaps any guidance on abstracts, because that tends to be more in that discipline. That may be helpful. There's a lot of great helpful stuff in both the APA guide and the MLA guide about abstracts. And basically what you're doing is you're writing an abstract when you do a proposal. So I would say look at that first, but then if you want to sit down with the LASTT model and past descriptions, see if they correspond. It's totally possible that they may not. But if you're starting to see a connection, then you might want to try using that particular model for those disciplinary conferences. But not having presented at English or humanities conferences specifically, I would say sit down with some descriptions first and see how well they match up before you go head first into the LASTT model. But I don't think it should be that different, because every conference, maybe with the exception of some applied sciences and whatnot, if you're doing a presentation, not delivering a paper, they're going to want to know why it's important, what it's contributing, and what your attendees are going to get out of it. So I do imagine keeping some of those elements in mind may be helpful. But again, take a look at the descriptions from past conferences. That's the best way to know what's successfully been accepted, and you can use that to model your description as well. I hope that answers the question. Any other questions? Let's see. So like I said, it's not the only model out there, and I came up with my model based on years and years of reading accepted session descriptions from conference programs. So if you're wondering if it's going to translate to a more specific discipline, again, best thing you can do is to sit down. I know it's boring. It's not the most fun activity, but sitting down with a couple of past programs, you will learn a ton. And then you might come up with your own model, and then you can share it with us and librarians who also have your disciplinary specialty, and that would be awesome too. I know it was a lot to throw at you today, so I just want to remind you that if you do think of something as soon as we sign off, because that's usually what happens to me, and no questions, and then we hit end meeting, and I'm like, 4 questions I could have asked. Again, don't hesitate to email me. If you want to send me a description, take a look at it either for our SUNY Law conference or even another conference you're thinking of submitting to and you want some feedback, I am happy to do that. I'm a huge nerd. I love conference proposals. I just got through a whole bunch for SUNY CIT. So please don't hesitate. I'm happy to do it. I love it. I'm a word nerd and a proposal nerd, so it'll be fun for me.
Well, thank you, Danielle. On behalf of the SUNY Law Conference Planning Committee, we do thank you for taking your time and staying with us to give us some feedback on how to submit conference proposals. So we thank you and we appreciate you. And I think a lot of us probably will take you up on that offer of looking at our conference proposals. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me today.